The Age of Nationalism, 1850 to 1914. The ideology known as nationalism originated during the international phase of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. Like classical liberalism, nationalists stressed the idea of self-determination, a belief that people with a shared ethnicity, race, language, religion, culture, history, and ancestry should have their own independent, separate nation, and once created, this nation had the right to exist in freedom. So, self-determination is about nation building. Nationalism is about nation building, building nations where they don't exist. Nationalism also stressed the belief in a national identity and mission. In other words, each nation represents certain values and ideals in the eyes of the world, and it is that nation's responsibility and mission or duty to spread those values and ideals around the world. Nationalism also creates the concept of we and they, that we as a nation are somehow better than all others. In other words, it leads to the belief that a nation is superior to all others. So people who live in the United States, for example, would say that the United States is better than other nations around the world, but then if you asked any other nation, they would say that they were better than us. So nationalism creates sort of a we-they concept, that we are superior and better to them. Our identity and mission is superior to all others. Sometimes this concept of we and they can be used by governments to create real or imaginary enemies in an attempt to unify the people for a common cause, a common goal, a common mission. Sometimes governments manipulate public opinion and create real or imaginary enemies for the nation. Nationalism also stresses the idea of progress. This, too, is an idea shared with classical liberalism. Progress is the belief that nations can get better, that better people and better societies can be created. So, if a nation already exists, nationalism is not about self-determination. Nationalism is about progress in nations that already exist. In other words, nationalism in a nation that already exists is about how that nation can improve itself and get better for the people who live there. So in our lecture about the age of nationalism, we're going to look at areas like Great Britain, France, and Russia, which were inspired by nationalism to achieve progress, to create better societies for the people who lived in those areas. Since Great Britain, France, and Russia were already unified countries, nationalism for them in the 19th century was about getting better. In the second half of the lecture, we'll talk about how nationalism inspired people of Italian descent to create their own independent separate country called Italy around 1861, and how German people were inspired by the ideals of nationalism to create their own independent separate country called Germany in 1871. So we start with nationalism in Great Britain. Nationalism in Great Britain was about making that country better, about achieving progress. The United Kingdom of Great Britain was made up of several parts in the 19th century. These included England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Nationalism in Great Britain, since it already existed as a unified country, was about making that country better, about achieving progress. Many individuals, like the head of Britain's Liberal Party, David Lloyd George, felt that progress could be achieved in Great Britain by moving that country towards liberal and socialist ideas. Here are a few examples of how Britain moved towards liberalism and socialism in the late 19th century. In 1884, the Reform Bill was passed, which granted universal male suffrage in Britain. Universal male suffrage is a classical liberal belief that all men, regardless of their social status, should have the right to vote. In 1884, that classical liberal goal was achieved with the Third Reform Bill. In the Third Reform Bill of 1884, all men in Britain were given the right to vote. The people's budget also indicates Britain's move towards liberalism and socialism. In Britain, extremely high taxes were levied on the rich as a result of the people's budget. These extremely high taxes were used to finance the people's budget and to give to the poor and middle class people at the expense of the rich certain social welfare measures. These included new ideas like national health insurance, unemployment benefits, and old age pensions, or what we would call retirement benefits today. So for all of its progress and making things better for lower and middle class people and all males in Britain, there was one major problem that the British government ignored, and that was the problem of Ireland. Between 1845 and 1911, in a period of about 60 years, the people of Ireland were starving to death in the millions. It is estimated that in a 60-year period from about 1845 to 1911, 4 million Irish people died as a result of the Great Potato Famine. The Irish people were extremely poor in the 19th century, living in dirt and straw hovels. Unemployment was rampant. It was common that people lived completely off potatoes, butter, and milk. It was said in this period that the average working man in Ireland consumed between 5 to 10 pounds of potatoes daily. So when this fungus called the potato blight attacked the potato crops between 1845 and 1911, it had devastating consequences for Irish families. People died in the millions, estimated at a total of 4 million. During the Great Potato Famine, the Irish people begged for relief from their government. Britain refused to help the Irish people. Some Irish, feeling that they had no options left, immigrated to the United States of America. Those who were left behind to continue to fight for survival during the Great Potato Famine blamed Britain for lack of help. The British government refused to give any sort of supplies or resources to the Irish people. Instead, they continued to raise taxes and property taxes on the Irish people, and they continued to collect rent from various farmers living in Ireland. So this lack of response, lack of help, and continued taxation on the Irish people led many Irish people to turn against the British government and to desire independence for all Irish people. So Britain's lack of response to the Irish potato famine led to a growing movement of nationalism towards the idea of self-determination for the Irish people. We turn our attention next to nationalism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1866, two German states, Austria and Hungary, came together to form the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The major problem facing this newly created Austro-Hungarian Empire were a large number of ethnic groups who lived there. These ethnic groups included Austrians and Hungarians, but also included Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks. All of these groups had a tendency to fight each other, and racial strife was quite common in Austria-Hungary. The government of Austria-Hungary saw an opportunity in nationalism to create an imaginary enemy for that country to unite all of these ethnic and racial groups together for the good of the country rather than tearing it apart. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire began to accuse Jewish people living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire of being responsible for all of the empire's problems. The Austro-Hungarian Empire stated that Jews were a biological threat to the German race, that Jews controlled all of the banks, and Jewish control of those banks had led to their recent economic problems. So what resulted in Austria-Hungary was the beginnings of anti-Semitism in modern times. The Jews were targeted as an imaginary enemy to unite all of the ethnic groups who lived in Austria-Hungary. The hotbed of anti-Semitism, or where it was most common anti-Jewish propaganda, was in the city of Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There it was quite common to see on every street corner, all day, every day, people preaching against the Jews, targeting them as a biological threat to the German race, accusing them of destroying Austria-Hungary's economy. So we wonder, what significance does this have on modern history? Well, living in Vienna, Austria at the time was a young man on an orphan pension who was trying desperately to get into art school after having dropped out of high school, and yet he was having no success getting into art school because he wasn't quite good enough to meet admission standards in Vienna. This young man lived in Vienna from 1905 to 1908 with no real job. Basically spent his time standing out on the streets of Vienna listening to anti-Jewish propaganda. This young man was Adolf Hitler, born in 1889, and of course would play a huge role in coming events in World War II. Adolf Hitler absorbed this anti-Jewish propaganda at a young, influential, and impressionable age, and of course we know that it had dire consequences in modern times. When Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Nazi Germany during World War II, he campaigned against the Jews and succeeded in killing roughly 6 million of them in what was called the Holocaust. The closest we ever get to an explanation from Adolf Hitler as to why he disliked the Jews so much was in his autobiography called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, and in it Adolf Hitler said that the first time he had ever been made aware of Jewish people, what they looked like and who they were, was in Vienna, Austria, and he attributed his anti-Jewish beliefs to his experiences as a young man living on the streets of Vienna while trying to get into art school. So this idea of creating an imaginary enemy for Austria-Hungary had devastating consequences for modern history. In an effort to unite the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the government of that area turned to anti-Semitism. Another way the Austro-Hungarian Empire attempted to unite all of its ethnic groups was by making official that only 2 languages could be used in Austria-Hungary. Those 2 languages were Austrian. That's just another kind of German. It's basically the same thing as German, just a bit more formal in some ways. And the Hungarian or Magyar languages. These 2 languages were the only acceptable languages to be used in schools and government proceedings. What the Austro-Hungarian government was trying to do was to unite the people by making them all speak one of 2 languages. What resulted is these various ethnic groups rebelled against that forced language choice of Austrian or Hungarian, stating that they should be allowed to use their own languages, Czech, Polish, whatever, in schools and in government proceedings. So nationalism in Austria-Hungary was about trying to bring the people together and unite them, but it failed on both accounts. Anti-Semitism did not unite the people, but it did turn them against the Jews with dire consequences. Using Austrian and Hungarian as the only 2 official languages in the country failed to unite the people as well. We turn our attention now to nationalism in France. The last time that we talked about politics in France, we ended with the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo and his subsequent exile to St. Helena, where he died in 1821. You might remember from that lecture that he suggested as his replacement twice his son, Napoleon II. Napoleon II was refused twice by the enemies of Napoleon who had defeated him at Waterloo. Instead, they chose as his replacement Louis XVIII, Louis XVIII succeeded to the throne of France twice. He was put on the throne after Napoleon was first forced to abdicate in 1814, but we may remember that Napoleon staged a comeback called the 100 Days before he was defeated at Waterloo. Once he was defeated yet again at Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, and he was replaced yet again by Louis XVIII. Louis XVIII was very unpopular during his early years. Louis XVIII was an elderly man riddled by gout and arthritis, and compared to the dashing military hero that Napoleon Bonaparte had been, many found Louis XVIII lacking in style, personality, and charisma. When he came to the throne in 1815, Louis XVIII knew that he was unpopular, and he needed somehow to win over the support of the French people. So he published for the French people what was called the Constitutional Charter, which guaranteed civil liberties, individual freedoms, and human rights to all French subjects. This, in fact, made him very popular by the end of his reign in 1824. When Louis XVIII died in 1824, he was succeeded by a cousin of his by the name of Charles X. Charles X was a throwback to the style of Louis XVI, Louis XV, and Louis XIV. Charles X attempted to restore absolutism in France, so his reign was quite short. His reign ended in 1830 when the French people rebelled against him and forced him off the throne of France. He was succeeded by Louis Philippe in 1830. Louis Philippe became the King of France in 1830 and promised massive reforms, even suggesting that he would offer universal male suffrage to the men of France. But he never made good on this promise, and by 1848, Louis Philippe was growing increasingly unpopular. He had only increased the number of voters in France by 70,000, and that 70,000 came from the upper middle class or the bourgeoisie. Louis Philippe was mockingly referred to as the bourgeoisie monarch because he seemed to only care about increasing voting rights for that one particular group. In 1848, the people of France rebelled again against Louis Philippe, and they forced him off the throne. They demanded that a popular election be held, that there would be no more kingship in France. They wanted a return to a republic where the leader for France would be popularly elected. So in December of 1848, presidential elections were held. Who would be president of the Second Republic, now proclaimed in France? Well, there were many names to choose from for the men who were voting, but one stood out to most of them because of his name. His name was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and what stood out to these male voters was the last part of his name, Napoleon Bonaparte. The French people loved and adored Napoleon Bonaparte, so anyone associated with him would be very popular. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was actually the nephew of the late, great Napoleon Bonaparte, or Emperor Napoleon I of France. So many historians have called Louis Napoleon Bonaparte a nobody with a famous name. What they mean by that is that he is famous in 1848 just for his name. He won the presidential election based on name recognition alone. People associated in France Napoleon Bonaparte with great things. So someone who was a relative like this guy, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who shared a name with Napoleon Bonaparte, must be pretty great. He is described as a nobody with a famous name. Now we understand the famous name part, but why a nobody? The reason why he's called a nobody is because he had no political experience whatsoever. If you want to stretch it, the only thing you can say that he had ever done that would fall into the category of civil service was that he had been a cop for a little while. He had been a police officer. Well, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte wins the election of 1848 overwhelmingly just because of his name. So Louis Napoleon Bonaparte becomes president of France in December of 1848. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte turned out to be very similar to his famous uncle. He was extremely ambitious. In his early years of political office, in 1848 to 1852, he achieved very little. In fact, the only thing that he does of significance is bad. In 1851, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the government of the Second Republic with soldiers who were loyal to him because the government refused to give him a second term. As they pointed out, all the men who put their name on the ballot for the presidential election of 1848 in France knew that if they won, they would be given one 4-year term. But Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was not satisfied with that. He wanted a second term, but we'll see quickly he actually wanted more than that. But he's saying in 1851 he wants a second term. So he staged an overthrow of the French government and then turned to the people, more or less asking for forgiveness for what he had just done. And he asked them, would you be willing to give me a second term as president of this country? Well, he has achieved nothing in his first 3 years in office, but 92% of the population agreed to give him a second term of 10 years. In the following year, 1852, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte turned yet again to the French voters and asked if they would be willing to make him emperor for life. And in 1852, 97% of the voters agreed, despite the fact that to this point Louis Napoleon Bonaparte had done nothing of great consequence except overthrow the French government. But they believed in him because of his name. So just like his uncle, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was Emperor of France. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, because he takes the title of emperor, has a name change. In 1852, when 97% of the voters in France agreed to make him emperor for life of their nation, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's name changes to Emperor Napoleon III. Now, I would like to point out to you that we've gone in exact chronological order. So why is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte Emperor Napoleon III when Napoleon Bonaparte was Emperor Napoleon I? Where is the second? Well, because the French people loved Napoleon Bonaparte so much, they gave his son, Napoleon, the title or number 2 after his name, even though he never actually ruled the country of France. So, not to confuse you, but Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's name changes in 1852 to Napoleon III, though he was actually the second man with the name Napoleon to officially own the throne of France. Emperor Napoleon III was extremely popular. Despite getting off to a rocky, uncertain start and not really achieving anything at all, Emperor Napoleon III turned out to be one of the most capable leaders in all of French history. He enjoyed a lot of popularity until the last year of his reign in 1871. In 1871, Emperor Napoleon III allowed himself to get goaded into a war with a neighboring German state called Prussia, and that war went very badly, resulting in the defeat of France. Things were so bad in the city of Paris, the people were surrounded by the Prussians, and France was cut off from its trade and supply lines, that the people of Paris actually invaded the Paris Zoo and ate zoo animals. So until 1871, Napoleon III was very popular, but his loss of the war with Prussia in 1871 resulted in a bit of a taint on his legacy and memory. From 1852 until 1871, Napoleon III enjoyed a lot of popularity among both conservative and liberal politicians in that country. Napoleon III was capable of appealing to both conservatives and liberals. How? Conservatives liked Emperor Napoleon III because he was a monarch and was a very strong leader, not tyrannical or not an absolutist leader, but they admired his strength of character. Liberals liked Napoleon III because of all the changes that he brought to France. He constructed many miles of railroads. He created public works projects which gave people construction jobs around France and at the same time beautified the city of Paris. In other words, Napoleon III sort of killed two birds with one stone. There was a problem in Paris with unemployment, and there was also a problem with dilapidated buildings, public monuments, and public parks. He saw a solution to both of those problems. That was to create government-sponsored construction jobs. People were paid by the government to build beautiful, wide, new avenues and streets through the downtown area of Paris, to fix and repair dilapidated structures, and to also build new government housing projects for the poor and homeless who had been living on the streets of Paris. So he gave people jobs, beautified the city of Paris, and repaired it at the same time, and created public housing projects. He also legalized credit unions, labor unions, and allowed workers in France's factories to strike for the first time. He also legalized strikes in the nation of France. Factory workers could now express their frustration and hostility over terrible working conditions by striking and refusing to work against their managers. Before in France, strikes had been illegal, and individuals who chose the option of striking and refusing to work could be fired at a minimum or jailed for engaging in a strike. But now Napoleon III is allowing the working class people to express their frustrations at work by making strikes legal. He also granted to the nation of France universal male suffrage. He allowed all males in France to vote. So Napoleon III did a lot to bring about progress in the nation of France. But all of that progress was almost undone by what was called the Dreyfus Affair from 1898 to 1899. A Jewish captain in the French army named Alfred Dreyfus was accused and found guilty of treason and sentenced to prison as a result. It was later found that Dreyfus had been framed for his crime. A janitor had planted evidence in the trash can of Alfred Dreyfus and pretended to find that information and present it to authorities. Alfred Dreyfus was accused of selling away French military secrets to French enemies. He was found guilty, and then later it was revealed that he had been framed by the janitor. In his retrial, the nation of France found itself polarized, divided in half between those who supported Dreyfus and those who were anti-Dreyfus. The people who tended to support Dreyfus were liberals. Those who were anti-Dreyfus were Catholic, anti-Semite, and members of the army. So France was polarized and divided over this case into pro-Dreyfus and anti-Dreyfus. What came out of the second trial was basically that Dreyfus had been somewhat victimized because of his religious status, that because he was a Jew, he felt he had been passed over for certain promotions, and that, of course, he had obviously been targeted and framed for treason because of his Jewish background. What resulted from this trial was that the French government realized that there should be somewhat of a don't ask, don't tell policy when it came to a person's religious affiliation. In other words, a person's religious affiliation should not guarantee them, nor should it prevent them from being able to achieve promotions. This led to an official separation of church and state in France. The country of France had been moving towards a separation of church and state for quite a while, but the Dreyfus Affair pushed that separation to the forefront. The government of France decided to have an official separation of church and state as a result of the Dreyfus Affair. This led to anti-Catholicism in that country because many of the liberals blamed Catholics for stirring up the Dreyfus Affair, for being behind his framing. So the government severed ties with the Catholic Church in order to maintain popular support. The government no longer paid or employed members of the church. They also broke away from supporting Catholic schools in the country with tax money. Instead, tax money was used to support newly created schools for boys and girls. These schools were compulsory. All boys and girls had to attend school. This is a great achievement for France. Before, the only boys and girls who had been able to attend school were those who were rich and could afford to send their children to Catholic schools. Now, tax money is not being used to support Catholic schools, but rather state-supported schools. So, all boys and girls were given the opportunity to go to school and to begin their day by singing hymns of praise to the nation of France, including the national anthem and a pledge of allegiance to that country, rather than starting their day with hymns to the church and to God. So what we see happen as a result of the Dreyfus Affair is a separation of church and state, state-supported schools for boys and girls of all social status, and patriotism resulting from those compulsory schools. Boys and girls are being indoctrinated every day to love and worship the nation of France. Next, we look at nationalism in Russia. Since Russia was already a unified country, nationalism there is about progress, making Russia better. But if you had asked Russians before the Crimean War, which began in 1853, how their nation was faring, they would have said they were doing really, really well, which is somewhat surprising because to the rest of Europe, Russia seemed a bit backwards and inferior. Russia, by comparison to the rest of Europe, had not begun to experience the Industrial Revolution at all. There was no industry in that country, not a single factory anywhere. In fact, serfdom or feudalism still existed in that country. 90+% of all people living in Russia were serfs. That meant that the economy of Russia was agrarian, rural, and agricultural. There was no industry there whatsoever. What showed Russia the truth about its circumstances was their participation in the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. Now, granted, this is a strange war. Between 1853 and 1856, France and Great Britain fought Russia for the right to be Christianity's champion against the Ottoman Turks. France and Great Britain were fighting against Russia to be the countries that fought against the Ottoman Turks in the constant, continual expansion of the Turks into the Middle East, Southern, and Eastern Europe. This is a strange reason for a war. We have Christian nations fighting each other over who is going to fight the Ottoman Turks. Those Muslims that we have seen since the age of discovery, who are increasingly gaining territory throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Russia lost this war horribly, basically because they had no way to effectively mobilize their troops. The Russians were shown by their loss in the Crimean War to Great Britain and France in 1856 that they had a long way to go. Their loss in the Crimean War inspired the Russians to try to overcome their backwardness. It inspired them to make a series of great reforms to make their country more along the same lines as the rest of Europe so that Russia could compete with Europe. These great reforms, which came about as a result of the Crimean War, included freeing the serfs in 1861. In 1861, there were only 2 countries in the Western world which held sizable portions of their populations in slavery. Those 2 countries were Russia and the United States of America. In 1861, Russia freed its serfs. They also set out to create better weapons and a better army. We'll talk more about that in successive lectures. Here, we need to note that another great reform inspired by the Crimean War was an attempt to build railroads throughout the nation of Russia. Russia in the 19th century was huge. It was approximately 8.3 million square miles. That is more than twice the size of the United States of America today, even if we include Alaska and Hawaii. So in this huge country of over 8 million square miles, Russia had only 1,500 miles of railroad. Some say a little less than that, somewhere between 1,250 and 1,500 miles of railroad in a country of 8+ million square miles. So it makes perfect sense when we say that Russia lacked infrastructure. There was no way that that country was connected at this point. There was no way that factories and industry could get started without the ability to quickly and effectively move goods, raw materials, and services from factories to markets. So, as a result of the Crimean War, the Russians began to build and create railroad tracks. By 1880, they had made a huge stride towards this effort. In 1880, there were 15,500 miles of railroad track. That's still not enough in a country of over 8 million square miles, but it is certainly an improvement. Once freed, the serfs were granted legal equality. Also, one of the great reforms made by Russia in this period was the granting of legal equality to all Russian people. One of the main figures in Russia's move towards progress and reform was a man named Sergei Witte, who was Minister of Finance from 1892 to 1903. Sergei Witte had a motto by which he lived and worked. This motto was "Use the West to catch up with the West." In other words, use Europe to catch up with Europe. If Russia had fallen behind, why doesn't it just copy what Europe is already doing to catch up with Europe? Another way to put this in an expression that we use today is why reinvent the wheel. What Sergei Witte was saying is if Europe has already invented constitutional forms of government, which Russia at this point is still an absolutist state with an all-powerful czar, he says if Europe has already invented constitutional monarchy. They've already gone through the Industrial Revolution. We can just copy and borrow from their examples. We do not have to figure all of this out from scratch. We can just borrow and copy ideas from Europe. So Sergei Witte set out to recruit European businessmen, entrepreneurs, merchant capitalists, overseers, and engineers in factories to come to Russia, and he lured them to Russia with very lucrative contracts. What he would tell these European businessmen is come to Russia, take our newly freed serfs, use them however you see fit. We don't want you to bring ideas about strikes and labor unions and all that stuff with you. We just want you to bring information about how to build, create, and start factories. And you're going to use our serfs, our freed serfs, as factory workers. Once you have the factory up and running and it's producing a profit, we will pay you for your work. Well, many businessmen from Europe went into Russia with the idea that they were going to get rich quickly, but it turned out that Sergei Witte was a bit of an unethical businessman. What was reported is that what he would do is he would meet with these entrepreneurs, merchant capitalists, businessmen, after they had set up the factory and it was working and was turning a profit, and he would ask them to present their copy of the contract. And when they did so, he would take the contract and rip it up and send these people back to Europe without paying them. So, of course, this was good for Russia economically and in terms of building industry, but it also led them to have a bit of a bad reputation in the eyes of Europe. But it worked for Russia. By 1903, using the West to catch up with the West, being a bit unethical, had resulted in 35,000 miles of railroad being constructed and industries popping up all over the place. In fact, by the year 1900, Russia ranked top in world manufacture of petroleum and steel. The only countries that were beating them in industry by 1900 were the United States of America and Germany. So Russia goes from in 1850 having no factories whatsoever, none, not a bit, all people working on the land as farmers, within just 50 years to being right up there with the United States and Germany in the production of petroleum and steel. Well, this newfound success in industry led Russia to become a bit imperialistic. We may remember from our previous lecture that imperialism is the desire for colonies. This led Russia to get involved in Korea and Chinese Manchuria. Russia desired to take those two areas, Chinese Manchuria and Korea, and add them to Russian territory. But there was also a tiny island country that was interested in those same two areas. That country was Japan. So, because Russia and Japan were both interested in adding Chinese Manchuria and Korea to their countries, a war resulted. It was called the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The Russians felt certain that they would win against Japan, that this was an opportunity to show the world how much Russia had achieved. They were looking for redemption from the Crimean War. Unfortunately for Russia, Japan beat them severely. Russia lost this war big time, and it was a huge embarrassment for the country. What it showed Russia yet again is that they had not gone quite far enough. Their military needed work. So the Russo-Japanese War was a huge embarrassment to the Russian people, and it led many of them to turn against the government, especially after the Bloody Sunday Massacre of January 1905. Now, the Bloody Sunday Massacre occurred on a Sunday in January 1905. Because the Russian calendar was a little bit mixed up at this time, we're not exactly sure what Sunday that was. Most say it was probably January 22nd, 1905. On January 22nd, 1905, an event known as Bloody Sunday transpires. Many people showed up outside Tsar Nicholas II's headquarters to protest Russia's loss against Japan, how badly the war was progressing, to protest against absolutism because, as they pointed out, the great reforms that had been underway were about making Russia equal to Europe. And they said, well, if we're going to be equal to the rest of Europe, we need a constitutional monarchy. So protesters assembled outside Tsar Nicholas II's headquarters to protest losses in the Russo-Japanese War, absolutism in Russia and its continuation there, and factory conditions. This was a peaceful protest. We don't know exactly how many people showed up. No one counted to see how many protesters were there, but the estimates range from a couple thousand to several thousand. So these protesters were led by a union leader, which that was an illegal position to have in Russia, who was also a priest. His name was Father Gapon. He and several thousand or a few thousand Russian workers gathered outside the Tsar's headquarters to peacefully protest. They were chanting and begging for change. What they did not realize was that Tsar Nicholas II was actually away from the headquarters at that time. Tsar Nicholas II had been in control of Russia since his reign began in 1894. He was not well thought of by the Russian people to begin with, and what is about to happen on Bloody Sunday, he was blamed for it even though he wasn't there. Tsar Nicholas II is usually described as being kind of dim-witted, not particularly bright, not really cut out for the job of czar. What he had wanted to be was a gentleman farmer. He had never actually wanted to be the Tsar of Russia anyway, but it fell to him, and he took the position but was not real crazy about it, so he tried to stay gone from the job as much as possible, and he happened to be gone on January 22nd, 1905. He left behind some young, inexperienced soldiers to oversee the palace in his absence. These soldiers saw this growing number of protesters, even though they were peaceful, and got nervous. They wanted to stay in the Tsar's favor, so they didn't know whether they should allow the crowd to continue to swell or if they should disperse it. Now, what exactly happens, we're not sure. All we know is that some soldier, for some reason, opened fire into the crowd, and a stampede resulted. So many of the protesters were killed in a stampede. They were trampled to death by their fellow protesters who were fleeing from the rifle shots of these troops protecting the Tsar's palace. And then total chaos broke out. When the people started to rush and run away from the rifle shot, the soldiers took that to be that they were growing somewhat aggressive and running towards them. So all of the soldiers opened fire and killed the majority of those demonstrators. Therefore, that incident is known as the Bloody Sunday Massacre. What was a peaceful demonstration became a massacre because of the Tsar's inexperienced soldiers. After January 1905, Nicholas was called Bloody Nicholas, though he was not even present at the time of this massacre. People began to protest against Nicholas. He was dim-witted. They did not respect him anyway. They wanted an end to absolutism, and as a result of the Bloody Sunday Massacre, the nation of Russia was on the verge of civil war. By October of 1905, the frustration of the workers in these factories in Russia who were being treated very poorly on the job, people who desire to move towards constitutionalism took out their frustrations towards the government, and by October of 1905, Tsar Nicholas II realized he had to do something to win over the support of the people, or he was going to have a full-scale revolution on his hands. So in October of 1905, Tsar Nicholas II, now forever known as Bloody Nicholas, issues the October Manifesto to buy the support of the people. In it, he granted full civil rights to all Russian people, and he said that he would transform Russia from an absolutist state to a constitutional state. In other words, he's willing to share his power with representatives of the people. So he calls for elections for the people to choose representatives to serve in what the Russians called a Duma. That's their word for parliament. And so these representatives show up and they tell Nicholas II, your October Manifesto doesn't go far enough. You need to make more changes for the Russian people. We need to move quickly towards progress in this country to avoid revolution. Well, this is not what Tsar Nicholas II wanted to hear, so he dismissed the first Duma, had elections called again. Most of the same guys are elected again to the second Duma, and they challenge him again when they reassemble. So Nicholas II dismisses the second Duma as well. So it's almost like he missed the point of what a constitutional monarchy was all about. The Duma was acting responsibly. They were representing the wants and needs and desires of the people, but Tsar Nicholas II was not open to it like he had said he would be. So he dismissed them twice and continued to rule Russia absolutely and pushed that country in a dangerous direction until 1917. He grows increasingly unpopular, and as we'll see in a later lecture, his lack of response to Russia's problems leads to the growth of communism in that country and to the murder of Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family.